According to historical reports, there have been black Africans in the Middle East and northern parts of Africa for hundreds, if not thousands, of years. This includes the land we now call Israel. Over the last few decades, many more Jewish Africans and non-Jews descended from Africans have migrated to Israel in the same fashion that others have for centuries. This move to what multiple religions consider the Holy Land is known as making Aliyah in the Jewish faith and is one of the most basic tenets of Zionism. The law of return that was passed by the Israeli parliament in 1950 gives all diaspora Jews, as well as their children and grandchildren, the right to relocate to Israel and acquire Israeli citizenship on the basis of connecting to their Jewish identity. Even so, African-descended Jews and non-Jews have not always been welcome in Israel, neither by its government or its citizens. In this video, I'll dive into the history of Black people and Africans in Israel and look at why they haven't been able to find peace in a land they seek to call home. The religious history of Black and African Jews traces its beginnings back over 2,000 years to the migration of Jews from Egypt during biblical times. Ethiopian Jews believe themselves to be the remnant of the lost tribe of Dan, one of the 10 tribes of Israel captured by the Assyrians in 722 BC. Other Ethiopian Jews believe themselves to be descendants of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. For the last 2,000 years, Ethiopian Jews have lived in the mountains of Ethiopia, practicing a traditional form of Judaism. Unlike other Jewish groups following World War II, Ethiopians found it difficult to gain recognition for the purpose of returning to Israel. That was until 1973, when Sephardic Chief Rabbi of Israel, Ovadia Yosef, officially declared them bona fide members of the Jewish community and thus eligible to return to Israel as citizens under the law of return. Facing anti-Semitism in Ethiopia, the Jews of Ethiopia, or Beta Israel as they prefer being called, were anxious to leave Ethiopia for Jerusalem and Israel more broadly, which they call the Promised Land. The Israel government and the Jewish Agency, a quasi-governmental agency in charge of immigration, attempted to have them brought to Israel but met opposition from the Ethiopian government, which had placed a general ban on its citizens leaving the country. A few Jewish Ethiopians managed to escape to Israel through Sudan early on. Massive airlifts from refugee camps in Sudan did not begin until the late 1970s. In the beginning, the secret airlifts brought about 8,000 Ethiopians to Israel from the Sudan. That is until the airlifts largely stopped in the 80s when the operation was made public. During the 1990s, thousands of more Jewish refugees from Eritrea were moved to Israel by the Israeli government. These missions brought tens of thousands of Jews from remote parts of Ethiopia, Sudan, and Eritrea who had suffered from religious persecution, famine, and civil wars. Currently, about 25,000 to 40,000 African refugees are believed to be living in Israel today. Many of the refugees are Jewish, some are not. However, refugees in Israel now are not welcome with the same warm embrace as they had been previously. Israel recognizes a very limited number of today's migrants from East Africa as legitimate asylum seekers, seeing them as mostly economic migrants who must leave. Only 30 years after the arrival of the first Ethiopian Jews to Israel and following recent violent clashes with the Israeli police, there is broad acknowledgement that the state of Israel failed appallingly in absorbing the Jewish Ethiopian community. To begin with, there was a lack of empathy in Israel's society for the hardships involved in leaving behind homes, relatives, and friends who could not make the journey. African refugees were welcome and granted the basic needs of accommodation, healthcare, education, and general welfare. However, this was done without sensitivity to their specific conditions, and from the outset, they faced discrimination and racism from the Israeli establishment who thought they were receiving handouts they didn't deserve or earn. Many in their religious establishment even questioned their Jewish identity and faith. One of the early incidents that exposed this disdain for African refugees was a revelation in the 1990s that the Israeli National Blood Bank had routinely destroyed blood donated by the Ethiopian and other African Israelis for fear of HIV. There was also a failure to integrate Jewish African refugees into other parts of society. For instance, while Ethiopian Israeli school children comprise only 2% of Israeli pupils, most of them study at schools that are predominantly Ethiopian instead of assimilating into schools with larger native Israeli populations. Even worse, the outcomes of Ethiopian school children are much worse than the general population, which blocks their path to academic success. The Hebrew Israelites is another group of Black people that reside in Israel. The Hebrew Israelites first made their way to Israel from the United States in the 1960s. While members do not consider themselves Jewish, they claim an ancestral connection to Israel. The Hebrew Israelites believe they are the descendants of the biblical tribes of Israel, who after the Roman conquest in 70 AD fled into the African interior and were ultimately taken as slaves to North America centuries later during the transatlantic slave trade. Today, around 3,000 Hebrew Israelites live in remote, isolated towns in southern Israel. The Village of Peace, a bevy of small buildings surrounded by vegetable patches and gardens in Dimona, is the community's epicenter. Over decades, the Hebrew Israelites have made gradual inroads into Israeli society. After years of bureaucratic wrangling, about 500 members hold Israeli citizenship, and most of the rest have permanent residency. But as of 2023, 130 Hebrew Israelites say they have no formal status and now face deportation. Some of the Hebrew Israelites don't have foreign passports and say they have spent their entire adult lives in Israel and have nowhere to go. This community's fight to secure its status as citizens or permanent residents shines a light on Israel's strict immigration policy, which continues to grant people it considers Jewish automatic citizenship, but limits entry to others who don't fall under its definition. The African or Black Hebrew Israelites are one of a number of Black religious groups in the U.S. that emerged in the late 19th and 20th centuries and encompass a wide spectrum of Christian and Jewish-inspired beliefs. Some fringe Black Hebrew Israelite groups in the U.S. hold extremist or anti-Semitic views, according to the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center. The community in Dimona, though, does not espouse such beliefs. Israel's Population and Immigration Authority said the individuals subject to deportation had never appeared on lists submitted by the Hebrew Israelite leaders and that some had just entered Israel recently. Violence against African-descendant immigrants and refugees throughout Israel has been prolonged and largely unchecked. In January 2014, an Israeli man walked up to an African refugee who was carrying a 1-year-old baby in downtown Tel Aviv and stabbed the baby in the head 3 times. Apprehended by the police and asked why he had attacked the toddler, the stabber said, "They said that a black baby, blacks in general, are terrorists." The stabber of the 1-year-old African baby was not sentenced to jail time because he was deemed to be mentally unstable. Haftum Zarhum was an African refugee who was shot and beaten to death by a mob of Israelis the following year in the central bus station of the southern city of Beersheba. Zarhum was pummeled into a pulp on the belief that he was a terrorist, although there is no proof that this claim was true. The Israeli state lawyer offered 4 of the Israelis who killed Zarhum an easy deal: no jail time, only community service. In 2014, Israel completed a fence along more than 120 miles of the border with Sinai that it had begun building in 2010 to help mitigate the waves of African immigrants trying to enter the country. According to Israeli authorities, illegal migration slowed to a trickle after the border fence was completed. Netanyahu, the current prime minister of Israel, said that the only way in which Israel can ensure that it remains a Jewish democratic state is to keep the migrants out. Former U.S. President Donald Trump pointed to the wall as a model for what he wanted to accomplish along the Mexican border. Israel's High Court of Justice recently halted Israel's campaign to deport unmarried male migrants to third-party countries, widely reported to be Rwanda and Uganda. The Africans, nearly all from dictatorial Eritrea and war-torn Sudan, say they fled for their lives and face renewed danger if they return. Israel considers the vast majority of them to be job seekers and says it has no legal obligation to keep them, and Israeli officials commonly refer to them as infiltrators. Over the years, Israel has tried a variety of schemes to force African people out, including sending many to a remote prison, holding part of their wages until they agree to leave the country, or offering them cash payments to move to somewhere in Africa. Critics of such tactics have said the government is trying to coerce asylum seekers into leaving Israel. In recent years, Netanyahu's far-right coalition government has called for deportations while blaming the High Court for blocking deportation attempts in the past. Under international law, Israel cannot forcibly send people back to a country where their life or liberty may be at risk. The peril of black people in Israel shows us that while the greatest danger posed to African refugees in Israel is a plan to deport them back into dangerous conditions, they also face danger and discrimination if they are allowed to stay in Israel. Whether Africans and black people continue to migrate to Israel is yet to be seen, considering the government's desire to deport recent migrants and its failure to recognize the legitimate Jewish faith of many refugees. So tell me, did you know the history of Africans and African-descended people in Israel? And does Israel have an obligation to welcome Jewish and non-Jewish migrants? Leave a comment below and let me know what you think. Until next time, this is Black Rhetoric signing off.